morning, everybody, and welcome to our second lesson on the American Civil War, titled Behind the Lines. We will not be getting into the details of battles in this series of lessons on the American Civil War, but I do want to set the stage for how the Union won the war, despite some problems that the Union had. The American Civil War is the largest war ever fought in the Americas, North or South. 900,000 men fought for the Confederate States of America, while 2 million fought for the Union. And more Americans die in the American Civil War than in any other conflict. And in fact, more will die in the American Civil War than in all other conflicts that the United States has been involved in put together. This was a huge fight, but right away we can see that the Union is going to hold an advantage. One reason the Union wins is the pure numbers. They have a 2-to-1 advantage in fighting men. Wartime government. In a long war, government policies are as important, sometimes more important, than the decisions of generals. A brilliant general can win a short war quickly, and they don't need to worry about the government as a whole. But when war goes for a long time, the actions of governments have real impact on that fighting. Now, the Union and the Confederacy were both led by men who understood war and understood the importance of supplies and finance and of silencing opposition and making sure that the other side did not have support within your home. Now, in the North, we had individuals who were opposed to Lincoln. One of those were the Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans believed that Lincoln did not go far enough. They wanted Lincoln to stand up and denounce slavery as an institution, to say slavery is wrong, immoral, and illegal. And they did not like that initially he had refused to end slavery. Also in the North, we had people called Peace Democrats. They were nicknamed Copperheads after a dangerous, venomous snake. They wanted the South to secede. They were fine with the idea of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, etc., creating their own country. They wanted peace, and they were willing to give up the southern states to have it. Now, Lincoln did not agree with either of these positions early in the war. And to maintain control, he suspended some state governments, particularly in Maryland, and said simply that the state government, the representatives elected by the people of Maryland, were not allowed to lead that state. They also denied Confederate supporters the right to a trial. So certain core American beliefs, the right to a trial and of elected representatives, are being denied to American citizens by Lincoln. Many people saw Lincoln as somebody who was willing to destroy the Constitution to save our Union. Now, in the South, Jefferson Davis was also having trouble. He struggled to lead a nation because part of his nation's belief was a right to states' rights, that state governments were superior to the federal government, which meant that if he, as a president of the Confederate States of America, wanted a state to do something, the state could say no. And many refused to say yes to many of the things Jefferson Davis wanted. He also had problems in the South where there were communities that opposed slavery. And there were communities within the South that resisted slavery and resisted the Confederacy and would fight against Confederate governments. Raising armies was another challenge for both sides. As the war dragged on, both sides began to rely on conscription. Conscription is forced military service. It's telling somebody that they have to fight in the army. In the Confederacy, they did this for any man between the age of 18 and 50. 18 and 50. It's a wide range of people who are forced to fight. In the Union, they did a similar thing. They conscripted men between the age of 20 and 45. See, back in the 1860s, they believed that an 18-year-old was still too young to fight in a war. We'll change that later on in Vietnam when we need to get more men to sign up to fight, and we make that kind of a standard 18. In the Union, I'm sorry, it was earlier than Vietnam. I misspoke there. In the Union, a man could pay $300 or hire a substitute to avoid fighting. So if you were drafted, if they called your name, you could opt out. You could hire somebody else to fight for you, or simply pay for the Army service. Now, some states offered a bounty, that is extra money, a payment for those who volunteered. So if we didn't have to draft you, if you just stood up and said, I'm willing to fight, sign me up, give me my gun, I'll go, they would pay you. But some soldiers, they abused this system. They would sign up in one state, say Michigan, and they would get their bounty, they'd get their money, and then they would desert, they'd disappear. They'd reappear again in New York, and they'd say, hey, sign me up, I'm ready to fight, and they'd collect money again. And then they'd take off for New Hampshire and repeat the process. This was called a bounty jumper. Now, the wartime economies become very important in the long-term victory of the North. This is a big part of why the North wins the American Civil War. It's because the economy grew stronger as the war went on. More and more Union factories opened to produce more and more goods for the war. Guns needed to be produced, uniforms needed to be produced, boots needed to be produced, and all of this stuff was being made in Union factories. But the South grew weaker. They didn't have enough factories to begin with, and the Union kept invading the South. Plus, they had established this blockade, ships that surrounded southern ports that kept the southern economy from getting imports. They couldn't trade with other nations. They were being strangled by the Union Navy in the South and by the Union Army in the North and West. They couldn't get more supplies, and they couldn't make it for themselves. So their economy was getting incredibly weak. Now, to pay for the war, because you got to pay for things, you got to buy materials, you got to pay your soldiers, both the Union and the Confederacy had to raise taxes to do this. People never liked taxes, but in the North, they could afford it. People had the factory jobs. The economy in the North was recovering and doing well. So even though taxes were going up and nobody likes that, people had money to pay those taxes. In the South, though, they couldn't pay. People didn't have enough jobs. There wasn't enough income coming in. And Southerners, no matter how much they raised taxes, people couldn't pay. Now, both sides tried to solve some economic problems simply by printing more money. The federal government would print money. The Confederate government would print money. And they would use that printed money to pay for things. But this leads to inflation. The more money you have in a system, the less that money is worth. So in the South, this combination of high taxes but fewer people paying it, printing money leading to inflation, meant that the South really struggled to provide supplies to their armies. And they regularly went into battle with old boots and less ammunition. Now, a side note for this lesson, I wanted to also talk about some other hardships of war, including medical care. Medicine during the American Civil War was very poor. We did not know much about infectious disease, and so we would do things like, if somebody had a gunshot wound to their lower leg, they would simply take a saw and saw off that leg to try to prevent it from becoming infected. And then they would use that same saw on a half a dozen other legs that same day without washing it, because they didn't understand how disease gets transmitted through blood. So if any one of those people was sick, they would spread that illness to others who now not only had their leg cut off, but also had whatever diseases or illnesses the last patient had. This would lead to a lot of death. And more than half of the men who died in the U.S. Civil War died of disease. Now, it's not necessarily because of a saw on their leg. There were a lot of diseases spreading because people were using unsafe water, etc., etc. Now, part of the effort to help these men and to make these conditions better was started by this woman here, Clara Barton. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross after being a union nurse and seeing the conditions that were happening in these hospitals behind the battle lines. So something good did come out of this medical mess in the American Civil War. All right, well, that's it for today. Today we looked at why the North won the war from the behind-the-lines standpoint. They had more men. They had better supplies, a stronger economy. And the South struggled with taxation and inflation and simply not having enough money. All right, that is all for today. I hope you learned something and enjoyed yourself a little bit, and farewell.